It's been my observation that many atheists are confused with the topic of morality and ethics. By confused, what I mean is they don't have internal consistency with their beliefs. In this vid, I'll show that the logical progression of atheism in regards to ethics leads to nihilism. Regardless of how unpleasant it may seem to refer to morality as an illusion, the intellectually honest atheist must do so in order to hold internal consistency with their belief system. First, a definition of terms. Morality and ethics is a description of values and behavior that one ought to have. It is not simply describing behavior that is, but rather the behavior that ought to be. To define ethics as simply a type of behavior in no way means that one ought to behave that way. A famous philosopher, David Hume, aptly pointed out that it is logically impossible to derive an ought from an is, or a value from a fact. So while you may describe altruism, compassion, and kindness as ethical behavior, you are really just describing a type of behavior that is, rather than showing that one ought to behave that way. It's important to properly understand that ethics and morality is based upon how things ought to be. To say giving food to the homeless is kind is completely different than saying one ought to give food to the homeless. The statement that giving food to the homeless is kind, that is a fact. But to derive a value out of that, saying being kind is a value that you should cherish and uphold, that does not logically derive from the fact that giving food to the homeless is kind. For example, you could also say the statement that beating up homeless for fun is unkind is a fact. So would you then say that you ought to value being unkind because it is a fact that beating them up is unkind? No, you're just stating facts, and you will never get a value out of that. So morality isn't really talking about what is, it's talking about what ought to be. So killing your friend in cold blood is a fact. It is what is. Morality is concerned with whether or not you ought to have done that. And remember, saying you ought to do this or that is totally different from the subjective statement of I prefer to do this or that. For example, I prefer steak over chicken, but that does not mean I think that one ought to eat steak. There are many nihilists who are watching this now that they understand all the things that I've been talking about so far, and they agree with them. But they will say, I prefer that people are kind, I strongly dislike killing, but they acknowledge that as their subjective preference, and they don't believe in any kind of morality. So subjective preference of preferring things to be a certain way is not at all what morality and ethics is about. So if you're an atheist and don't believe in morality and in ethics, then your beliefs on morality are consistent with your atheism. So what about atheists who do believe that morality is a real thing? That there is such a thing that we can call good and bad behavior, that people ought to behave in a certain way? There are many atheist productions that I've come across that make the argument that an atheist is a better person compared to a religious believer because an atheist does good acts for the sake of goodness as opposed to attempting to avoid hell or some such nonsense. They also refer to a lot of acts that have been done in the name of religion as bad, horrible things, as evil things that ought to be avoided. Quite obviously, all of these things allude to a belief that there is a system of morality that one ought to adhere to. So there's a few predominating ideals that atheists hold as their evidence for morality being a real thing, that there is a moral code that everyone ought to adhere to. There's a lot of them. I'm just going to talk about the main ones. They basically all suffer from the same logical flaw. I'll start with evolutionary psychology because that is the most common one that I see. It basically states that we evolved to have certain characteristics being compassionate to each other and such, which helped us survive, and therefore we ought to be compassionate to each other. The problem with this is that, yes, it's a fact that humans and other species have evolved to often act with kindness and compassion. But it is illogical to then say that we ought to apply a value to such behavior simply because it's present. Evolutionary psychology only describes what characteristics evolved within a species, and in no way can then lead to which characteristics ought to be valued and which ought to be avoided. The fact that you evolved to prefer certain types of behavior over others is simply a fact, and not a value that one ought to hold. A preference for wholesale murder may be unusual in a given species, but its unusual quality does not mean it ought to be avoided. Describing behavior in a species, even such behavior that is almost ubiquitous, is still only describing characteristics of the species. You are describing facts, not values. There are many characteristics our species holds, which range from compassion to aggression. It is not logic that applies value to certain characteristics above others, but cultural or otherwise subjective means. Due to evolution, most people are born with characteristics that behave in ways that favor cooperation with their immediate tribe. But this speaks nothing of values. An individual or culture could choose to value death over life, enslavement over freedom, pain over pleasure, etc., etc., with no contradiction. We see this in healthy adults who choose not to have children. It is of central importance of evolution that people are born with the characteristics to drive them to have offspring, and this drive is nearly ubiquitous, but some healthy adults choose not to do this, and value a life without offspring above one with offspring. There is no contradiction in this, despite the fact that most other people of the species have a different value. This same principle applies to every other characteristic we have. Humanism is flawed in a similar way. It's a broad subject, but the logical flaws are right at the core, which is easy to define. Humanism values traditional ethics, such as life over death, pleasure over pain, freedom over enslavement, etc., etc. So a humanist would frown upon someone enslaving a different culture or mass genocide, and so on. Humanism holds that one ought to base his or her values upon human empathy. That's its core. However, this is circular logic, since it's trying to prove that values stemming from empathy are the best, with the assumption that empathy is the best value. If one chooses not to value empathy at all, then humanism is completely pointless. Empathy is one characteristic of many that we have, and the idea that one ought to value it is purely subjective. As such, all of humanism is completely subjective and has no basis for real morality, only subjective preferences. So an intellectually honest atheist could still be a humanist as long as he or she recognizes it for what it is, a subjective ideal, holding no more real meaning or value than any other ideal that has ever existed. It should be viewed simply as what they prefer, and not objectively better than anything else.
Which is why I am speaking now to inform others of secular humanism. It just may be a fit with your non-religious beliefs and allow you to give those nagging theists some clear positive claims about your beliefs, which are based on science and reason instead of blind, unsubstantiated faith and appeals to emotion. And the next time a theist asks you what you believe or asserts that you believe in nothing, secular humanism is a great answer to shoot back at them. Followed, of course, by a reminder to them that their own beliefs require logical fact-based evidence, or the admission that there is none.
Oh, really? So what evidence do you have that empathy is the best value, or that anything ought to be valued more than something else? There is no reasoning or evidence whatsoever that something ought to be valued above anything else, including things like empathy, compassion, etc. It is a fact that humans have the characteristic of empathy. It is also a fact that humans have the characteristic of selfishness. what evidence do you have that empathy ought to be valued over selfishness? Even displaying evidence that cultures prosper in peaceful, happy, productive states more often when empathy is valued, you are once again begging the question, since such a culture would only be desired should one value empathy, happiness, productivity, etc. in the first place. You, my friend the humanist, have no evidence whatsoever for your beliefs. They are subjective preferences, and that's it. Categorical imperative, or the golden rule, that you ought to treat others as you want to be treated, is also assuming that empathy is the best value, and therefore it begs the question. The intellectually honest atheist must conclude that morality is an illusion. All ideals of morality are subjective preferences, and if someone happens to think differently than you, they aren't doing anything objectively wrong.